Welcome, baby. The NPC presents Smooth Finish with our hosts Rob Romano, Chris Marcano, and Brent Lane. These guys have more chemistry than your entire test kit. Ever enlightening and striving to be entertaining. So let's dive into their latest episode of the NPC's Smooth Finish.
Everybody, welcome back to Smooth Finish. I'm here with Rob Romano. What's doing, Robbie?
Hey guys, living it up in the heat here. We finally got warm.
All right. Well, and if you haven't heard,
93 today. 93 today.
93 in Connecticut.
Well, according to the governor of New York State, this is a temperature that we haven't seen in our lifetime. Now, she's older than me, and I know I've seen probably about, I don't know, at least 40, 90, or 100-degree days. So, just another day in Northeast.
Yeah, just watch the news because, you know, we're melting. We're melting. And Mr. Chris Marcano, our director, how we doing, sir?
Those glasses.
We're doing great. It's 90 degrees here in Kansas City, but it's extremely humid. So, as my grandfather used to say, it's as hot as a cheap pistol, a $2 pistol.
Yeah, well, I'm in Florida, so we don't need to go there on heat and humidity. I think I probably got you both covered up there.
Yeah,
so.
Oh, for sure. It's actually the weather. The weather's kind of turning around everywhere. I mean, as far as pool usage, which is always good, you know, which is ironic that we're talking about warm weather, considering that this episode, number 31, is all about the shrinkage.
Yes.
George Costanza comes to mind in that one.
So yeah,
well,
exactly.
Swimming pool and shrinkage are synonymous, right, guys? We've
right.
made this, right?
Now,
so.
Before we get going,
especially cold pools.
Yes. And before we get going, of course, we have to disclaim that we are not talking about the infamous George Costanza episode and that example of shrinkage. We are talking about plastic shrinkage, and we're going to get into it today. And Brent's gonna do a really in-depth summary of one of the more recent tech bulletins that the NPC has guided, directed, and funded for the industry. So without further ado, I think we just get into it. So jumping right into it, Brent, what exactly is plastic shrinkage?
Right. So it's a weird term because you think plastic, what's that mean? And as I kind of shared with Chris before we started here, plastic referring to like plasticity, right? The elasticity almost of what your cement's going to do and its workability and for how long. So plastic shrinkage, generally when you're talking about that, you're talking about the excessive amount of water loss when you're trying to work the material, when you're, you know, from the time you get water in it to the time you get it hard trout and you're getting water back in the pool. And a lot of that has to do because if it dries out on you too fast or it loses too much water, and we'll talk about reasons why. Biggest part of this bulletin is talking about, you know, basically ambient environment, meaning temperature and humidity and those types of things. Wind is obviously the biggest factor, and we'll talk about that a little more as we go here. But anything that's going to pull moisture from that product before it is ready to be set up and the water does what it's supposed to do. And I think we've talked about this a few times in different episodes. Water to me satisfies three things in the plaster environment. And the three things are the Wick effect. So that has a lot to do with your substrate, the water that your substrate's going to take away and also start that cling of plaster to the substrate. You have the water that you need. It's the second thing, the water that you need to both cure satisfy the chemical reaction that happens with cement in the matrix of the product. So you got to have enough water for that. And then, of course, the third thing, which is what we're talking about here today, is the ambient conditions. The other factors of the air, the heat, the sunlight, and the wind, they're going to pull, you know, moisture from your product. And you got to get it done before it does that and you start having issues.
So when we're talking about, you know, overall in that initial fill, there's three kind of buckets and you know, you refer to it as the demands of the water basically, but you have the wicking effect, the curing and chemical reaction, and then this specific variable here that we're talking about, which is the ambient conditions, right?
Right.
And you mentioned that there's kind of five dominant factors that really influence and can be the root cause of plastic shrinkage?
That's correct. And the bulletin basically names those out. And Robbie, what are they? Tell us what they are, Robbie.
Well, temperature, the ambient air, right? So what's the air temperature? And it could be even what the temperature factor is. So it could be 85, but really feel like it's 90. So those things come into play. So the ambient air temperature, how is that going to affect? A lot of pools come out better when you do them in the morning because it's a little cooler, and you get into the afternoon jobs. You're using, if you're using any calcium at all, you're using way less, and you might even have to put a retardant in it to try to let the finish last longer before it sets up. So the air temperature is real important. Also, the temperature of the shell is just as important. If you have a cold shell, you're going to have a little more difficulty having the finish stick to the shell. So if it's under 40 degrees, you might want to reconsider plastering that pool. But now you get into the summer months, and that shell is really hot. That's going to force the finish to go off faster. Okay, so it's really that's where closing your pools down become real important, not just for the hydration part of the shell, but also to help cool the shell down so it doesn't force your finish to go off faster. Temperature of your material, of the mix. If you have the ability, if you're in a hot air situation and you can add cold water, I know the water that comes out of the ground over here is 56 degrees, but it's been sitting in a mile-long hose all day. You want to let that run out before you put that into your mix. If you're using hose water from the house, and try to get cold water. I know here in the Northeast we don't have chillers or anything like that on our hose water. It's just what it is. It comes out of the tap. So you want to be cognizant of that. Humidity is real important.
Yeah.
If it's humid, you're not going to lose as much. But if it's dry, and I'm sure these guys in Arizona, this would be a good question for Laura, right? How do you combat the dry air out in the desert there when you're installing these finishes? You want to make sure that you have enough water in what was the term that John would use when you, not makeup water, but supplemental water to help to keep the finish moist enough so you can get it to finish. And here's something that we deal with a lot. It's fun because I live in Connecticut. Connecticut has tall trees. We get wind, but we also do a lot of work in Long Island, which is not far from here. Shorter trees, island, lots of wind. And I've seen where wind comes off the shoreline and will utterly destroy a sun shelf in a day. And they're trucking in water because that wind is just howling in there and it cracks up. That was a fun lesson to learn. So you want to, if you have an extremely windy day, you might want to, like, if you got 25 mile an hour winds, you might want to have a conversation with your builder and set up an expectation for what could happen if these winds are sustained, especially when it gets gusts up to 40 miles an hour, which does happen from time to time here. A day like that, we're calling it. We're not going to apply a finish with that. Now there's certain ways to combat wind and sun and heat and humidity. A lot of times it's to cover the pool. But when do you know when to do that? You don't. I'm scheduling out, a couple of weeks in advance, and I'm going to make it Tuesday 2 weeks from now. I'm not exactly sure what the weather's going to be. We're really trying to pay attention to what the rain's going to give us. But if it's an extremely windy day, it's not something you pick up for like a day or two before. And how do you scramble to cover that? You don't.
That's it. Yeah, it's an interesting concept because sometimes in certain environments, like you were saying Phoenix, right, or Arizona, low humidity, high winds often. So, they probably do take different precautions than maybe you would. You deal with other things. So it just really depends. In Florida, it's hard because rainstorms pop up, completely different scenario, what's going to happen to you when the rain goes blowing past. But yeah, I mean, it's hard to say, and it's just one of those things. And that's what this tech bulletin's kind of saying. Like there is things, specifically environmental air things that are happening on the job site that day, and we want to define those and what they can do. And what this paper does really well, and again, we're not be able to show you that you're talking about it, but there's nomographs, right? So that's a chart that allows you to look at 4 or 5, or however many you want, right? It measures in.
It's a multi-variable charts.
Yep, absolutely right. So, and we have 2 charts on there, and what those charts are measuring is the impact of the air temp, the relative humidity, and the wind speed. And the calculation that they're showing you is the rate of evaporation that, depending on how you go about that chart, right? Because you're coming from all different angles, how that evaporation, how low, how high, obviously, and what they really show, and I think they'll see when people see this, wind is certainly the biggest factor. As the wind rises, the evaporation rate really just screams right off the chart.
Right.
Humidity, like we said, it's generally a good thing for the scenario. Hot, you got hot, and one thing that's not mentioned here, we say heat or whatever, and Robbie, I know you know this, right? Sunlight. If you got sunlight hitting one spot of the pool, or it's just the prevailing side of the pool, it's getting hammered all day, and then you got one that's completely in the shade. That pool that you're going to do is one complete finish, one coating. It's interesting. You have to address it that way, and you have to approach the pool and do the things you need to do with your materials and the job site itself to control that as best as possible.
We have a high tech term for that: the sunny side of the pool and the shade side of the pool.
That's a technical term, ladies and gentlemen.
Well, the sun was certainly shining on this side here, and you could see the shade side didn't get as beat up as the sunshine side did.
Right.
Yeah.
Yes.
To your point, Brett, it's be sure and go to the website. Go to www.natural. I can't read my nationalplasterscouncil.com to make sure to get this. This is the tech bulletin entitled Plastic Shrinkage, Temperature versus Wind Speed. And you have to really see this to really appreciate the information that was created by the NPC for this. When you see these color coordinated charts, you'll really it will be your guide, right? Because it's not a calculator per se, it's more of a compass, and it will show you just by simply plugging in your job sites, these 4 variables, again, air temperature, relative humidity, your material temperature, and wind speed, and it'll kind of give you an idea of where you want to be and help guide you to make sure that you're within these ideal parameters that are outlined in detail in this tech bulletin. So, and it's again NPC Tech Bulletin number 8, entitled Plastic Shrinkage. But so be sure and go to the website as soon as you're done, or if you're listening to this now, and take a look at this, because it's invaluable information. And the way it's laid out, as robust as these charts are, they're color coordinated in a way that it just makes it very easy to read, and it's really easily digestible. And not only do we get into, like we've already discussed, some of the contributing factors to this issue with plastic shrinkage, but it also talks about some of the things you can do in detail to minimize your risk, right? And minimize the risk of having these things occur at your job. So it's a fantastic piece. So let's continue to talk about this, Brent. So we've got the nomographs, which are, again, multi-variable charts. I remember that. But what else do you want to highlight from the tech bulletin number?
Well,
8?
I mean, I think we could just talk about, some of the what are the problems that can be caused by this, right? So just identify those quick, and then obviously let's jump into some of the things that you can do. So obviously, if you've got some of these factors hitting you, you're going to have a decreased set time and working time to place the plaster. You're going to have an increased rate of drying. 2 things, both bad. Increased water demand, which obviously there's ways to approach that. Cold joints, which sounds weird because we're talking mostly about hot weather, and which, you know, Robbie shared. You can have some of this in cold weather, and I have plenty of examples where you have this. Again, it's all kind of related. If you have cold weather, the things that it can do to you, but cold joints. Interestingly enough, if one sets off hard and fast, like say that sun light wall and the shade wall are kind of touching, and one goes off faster than the other, and the other one's still hydrating, you know, it can certainly come off like a modeling scenario or hydration issue that would affect you, and maybe possibly not even bond correctly in the two spots.
You know, Brett, let me ask you this, because I kind of live in a bubble, and my bubble's pretty informative, but it's rare that I come across a cold joint scenario. You know, if I know that there's going to be a cold joint, and it usually happens on larger pools, and this is certainly a factor when you have a big commercial pool. If you know that you're going to be able to, like a cold joint for me is where you stop troweling, and then you have to then you pour again right up against that. Where that is, and, you know, in gunite terms, you have a cold joint. Supposedly, you won't have one because you're shooting it right in place. You know, the application parts, the application process are different over here. Some of us shoot it in where it's not as aggressive as a gunite, but in others, and can mix it in barrels on the side of the pool, dump it in, and either shovel it in place or however they do it. I would think that if you know you're going to have a scenario where you're going to have a cold joint, try to make those joints where there could be like a tile break in the pool, right? Or where it's a lot less, where you're not going to notice it, because I would think that you could potentially see that line with a cold joint.
Yeah,
now,
I get what you're saying, and yeah, that's kind of the traditional concept of cold joints, right? Where you got a humongous commercial pool, and you're just not going to be able to. You know, it's not one placement. You're going to have to do several placements, or, you know, the deep end's going to be done a different day, or for whatever reason, a different part of the day. You know, so yes, I get that. And I don't know. I think in this scenario, what we're talking about is
a little different. I understand.
Like you said, you don't know what's going to happen in 2 weeks. So if somebody cuts down a tree that was there when you quoted it, you're not thinking about it. Now that side of the pool's potentially getting blasted by sun. It's a super windy day. And you got the other side, because the wind's blowing from the right direction that hits the wall that's on the sun, that sucker's going off in a heartbeat, right? So if you haven't laid up that shaded and, you know, no wind at all side of the pool, you better put the plaster on that side first, right?
Well,
you better get that working pretty good before you lay up the other side, or you better heat up that stuff. Versus the other side, where obviously you probably shouldn't put any kind of accelerator in your mix. And that's just it. And I'd say this, the first one of the precautions they say in practices that can help you is surface saturation dry, right? That's a term that we hear quite often. But you got a pool, I can imagine in Phoenix, it probably drinks gallons of water before you plaster that pool. It's just good practice to, you know, water the finish. You don't want it to be completely dry. You want it to be saturated, but not standing water. You want it to be where it's not absorbing water. So you can imagine, back to the cold joint point, if it's a spot that, you know, you just wet the whole pool at the same rate, but you got one area that really still needs more water. What we talked about before, that what the water does for us, if that substrate's stealing way more water, you might have that problem, right? So that would flash off and make a cold joint for you, and potentially the check cracking and type of things that can happen. So surface saturation dry, it's the whole pool. It's parts of the pool. It really depends on what that shell's doing, because you have that sometimes too. Sometimes other parts of the shell are thirstier than others for whatever reason. So it's really just make sure that you're watering that pool really well, and you're making sure that no standing water, but it's nice and cooled down, and it's got the moisture it needs to satisfy the substrate without taking it from your material. You know, a good point of that is our material is only, 3/8 to 5/8, somewhere in that, maybe an inch. That's very thin. There's not a lot of water in that matrix when you're talking that thin of an application. Well, it's different in concrete, right?
every time you go trowel on, you're pulling the water out. You're getting your
Right.
aggregates to get nice and tight. So you're not only could it be absorbing that water or wicking that water out, you're pushing the water out too. So it's drying out a lot faster than on a nice cool day.
Right. So another point of that when we're talking substrate, and I don't know, this isn't everybody's practice. A lot of guys now are water blasting, and that's a great process to get to a nice rough surface. I see some complications with that as far as my personal observations, as far as uniform surface goes, because I mean, it'll take off what it can take off and it'll leave what it can. But sometimes you can, you got plasters that are nice and hard, and even with all that pressure, it'll leave like height variations, those types of things. I guess more what I'm trying to say here is like a uniform surface. We always say, Robbie, you have the class substrate, right? We talk about a uniform porous surface that hydrates very similar. One way you can do that, and not trying to sell product, because you can brown coat, right? You can put on a pre-coat finish that's modified, a sand and cement mixture that gives you an even surface that has the same cement factor and everything in it that's going to draw from your plaster the same. Bond coats, those types of products, again, similar type thing. Height, if you've pulled a D-lam out, you should really fill that spot. And now if you have a D-lam spot that's, let's say, 3 feet wide, that you have an inch thick material that's different from every other bit of material in that pool, that's where like a bond coat or a brown coat, all the same, can really help you with hydration and those types of things. And in this scenario, really the product will be able to cure equally. So it's just a nice comment to say, and the paper does talk on that as well.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, there's so much in this too, that specifically outlines the job site guidance as recommended to avoid this, especially during hot, windy conditions. But also it gives really, really detailed guidance for the design of the mix as well. So it's preparation, application, and the mix, right? It's all in this. This is one of my personal, I think this is one of the most robust tech papers that we've put out.
Yeah. So yeah, you're right, Chris. So it goes on to tell you, obviously you can put more, like throw money at it or throw labor at it, right? If you got if you have bad conditions, you can only put so many applicators in a pool. But if they can properly place in less time, then you obviously need more people. So that's something that you can do. And it suggests that, like, hey, consider increasing your labor.
Sure.
Use light reflective hoses and tarps. Tent the project. That's a pain in the ass. Can you imagine? You're going to tent every pool you do. If you build it into your cost, great. But
it's fine because when it rains, we put a bubble over the pool. But when it's windy, that bubble is not strong enough to hold the wind back.
Right.
I mean, you need a real structure or something with a little more substance to it than just a bubble that's being blown up by fans to hold that back. Extra guys. We always have an 8-man crew on a job, but if we know it's going to be big and extra hot, we're going to throw an extra guy or two on that particular job.
Sure.
Right. And then to Chris's point, there's a good amount of recommendations to consider with your mix to help you adjust the matrix and the mix of your product. This sounds weird, but this can happen easily, right? You can pop up a beach umbrella over your mixing station and your product on your truck, or at least cover it. If your water's super hot because it's been blasted all day, and your rocks are hot, everything's hot. Guys put accelerator. Basically, what accelerators or calcium chloride does in mixes is it heats up the water, and heating up the water and heating up the cement is what makes it set faster. So any heat that you're putting in this scenario that you can control, it would probably be smart to control. There's a lot of guys, and this is an interesting one. You can use chilled water, or some guys, when it's super hot, they throw ice right in their mixed water.
Yeah.
And cool it down, right? Because by the time it's done mixing, it's not detrimental that it's going to cause the cement not to mix, because by the time all that friction and all that happens, it might be a chilled water, but it's certainly not going to stop your product from setting. So that's an interesting take. And most guys, like you said, Robbie, if it's in the hose and it's getting blasted all day, run the hose first. You know what I mean? Run the hot water out of the hose
Didn't we learn that lesson? Didn't we learn that lesson as kids? No one wanted to take that first hit off the hot hose, right? That'll take your lips off.
Hey,
it tastes awful, and you burn your face
hose,
off,
right?
Yeah,
And that's what we were raised on, folks. Hose water, hot hose water.
You know, there is out there, there's slower setting cements that or you know, a lot of applicators, they use different types of cements, and there's cements, you know, some of them are already pre-modified.
There's a lot of truth to that.
Yeah, they're pre-modified, and or they're just by nature, they're a slower setting cement. So if you know you got a hot, humid day and you got a couple cements you can choose from, maybe choose the one that sets a little slower, you know. A good thing always, add mixes, polymers, pozzolans, the things that will give you workability, water reducer would be a smart one, right? So you're actually using less water, but getting more workability. So if you put a little extra water, you know, you're not really overwatering the cement and potentially losing the strength of that cement, because that water reducer is giving you that let's call it plasticity, right? Or that the movement and the workability of the product and the mix in general. And then of course, and Rob, you said this earlier, so, you know, supplemental water while you're mixing, not so much, but while you're troweling. You know, you'll see guys that'll have, you know, a modified water bottle or whatever, that, you know, when they need a little bit more lubrication water, supplemental water,
just a sponge.
Yep, they'll put it in that spot so they can get ahead and get that worked and not let it dry out on them as they pull the fat out of their last trowelings and those types of things. So, you know, again, I'm reiterating what this paper says, and I think that's kind of the point. I think this is a great, not only for plasterers to have a better understanding or get some great tips for their own work, but a great thing for builders to understand why they see plasters doing some of the things they're doing, or maybe they could recommend if there's been, you know, a run of issues, the same issue or plastic shrinkage, and, you know, maybe again, education is key, right? So this paper to me is what a great tool to address a pretty common issue, especially right now in the summertime, guys trying to do a couple pools because they're busy, that type of thing. You know, the other consideration, you know, don't plaster first thing in the morning. I think it even says that in the paper. You know, plaster in the morning, or plaster, you know, in the evening, and use artificial light if you had to. But again, there's just times and ways that you can approach and not have issues and ultimately have a successful finish.
Well, it's one of the practices that we have in our company is in the springtime we have a very small window to get 500 pools done before Memorial Day or 4th of July. And as we get closer to the July 4th deadline, and Father's Day and July 4th, it's hot. Like today, it's 93 degrees. The guys are getting to the jobs extra early, sometimes waking the customers up because they roll in so early to get that first job done so they can actually make it to the next job early enough where it's, by the time you get a 3 o'clock sun, it's 93, or, you know, and that's really going to pose the problems. Or we schedule things going, you know, after the next couple of weeks or so, we'll be scheduling things where it's 1 pool a day, and not doing 2 pools a day, and trying to get in. Because a lot of it has to do with the fact that we do kind of slow down a bit because now it's summer. No one wants us in their backyard, and that's convenient in this particular sense. I mean, of course, we want to do 2 pools a day all the way through the season, maximize our efforts there, but there's a trade-off there. And I would stress, especially in our area, you know, we have a lot of wells in Connecticut. Long Island doesn't have a lot of wells, for example, and I can only speak to that area. Long Island, they love using the hose water to fill the pool. Guess what happens after 3 days of filling the pool? You've got heat, you've got if you have a dry day or you got wind, that is not helping your scenario out at all. If it's making it worse. So truck water in if you can, whenever you can. I mean, that's what we do here. And then again, I live in my little bubble. That's what I'm used to. So we stress filling the pools up as quickly as possible to help mitigate the drying of the finish and those check cracks happening that usually will happen on the sun shelf, the top step, or the benches, you know, or the top part of the wall. So try to do that as often as possible. Get those pools filled as quickly as possible.
Yeah, it's interesting you say it, Rob, because in the Northeast, that's a very common practice. But you come down to Florida, there are not a lot of water trucks down here doing that process. It's just not, it is it's the hose in the end and whatever, or maybe two hoses, hopefully with something on the end and filtered and all the good stuff it's supposed to be. On larger projects, we'd always say, you can set up, and again, here we go with time and energy and effort, but a misting system, or even as simple as like a sprinkler or something that will at least continue to keep everything hydrated, and not separately, but together, but at least so it can't dry out on you. So it can stay underwater, or as it rises, at least the rest of the finish is also wet. Again, Wick effect, that water is going up the wall, but it only gets so far. But you definitely, if you could do a misting system or set up some sort of, your plaster should be hard enough when you're putting water in the pool. So it wouldn't be a problem to add some sort of misting sprinkler, something that certainly will help you with check cracking, those types of things, especially on the top steps, the areas that get the water last. If you're not considering that stuff, you're bound to probably have problems even after you leave and there wasn't a problem. So it's a good point.
Yeah. So, and if you do that, you make sure, please, that you keep it continuously wet, especially on a colored pool while it's filling. You can't wet it and then let it dry, because it could hydrate differently.
Yeah, absolutely. Never turn water off. Right? Make sure it's full so it's above the tile, or you'll have a nice ring.
Well, you'd be surprised. You tell the builder to go out there. I just hosed it down, then I stopped. There's a puddle in the shallow end, and that puddle's going to hydrate and show. So when you commit, you got to commit to the whole thing.
Yeah.
All right. So be sure and go, all the listeners out there. Again, this was funded, directed, guided, and created for you out there to better serve the homeowners and pools that are out there being finished. It's the NPC Technical Bulletin number 8, available for free of charge. This is what we do. We better the industry, one tech bulletin, one podcast, one conversation at a time. But go to nationalplasterscouncil.com, and it's the tech bulletin number 8, entitled Plastic Shrinkage. And the beautiful thing about this, it's 4 pages. It's very comprehensive, but it's organized and written in a way where it's very easily digestible. This isn't going to be an over anyone's head, and it really puts a clear and concise spotlight on the issues that can arise, what can cause these issues, what issues can arise from these variables that are out there, most of them environmental, of course, but then it gives you guidance on how to navigate the challenges that can arise from these environmental conditions. So it's an awesome tech bulletin. Be sure and download it, share it, and again, it's a chore to put these together, especially when you look at all the third-party validation that the NPC does and insists on, because of the standards that we do have. But this one's a good one. So download it, share it, use it. It's just going to help you be a better applicator at the end of the day.
Chris, I think you've brought us to a smooth finish, my friend.
Right.
Gentlemen, I think that was a great conversation, great way to, get this one out there, and hopefully people utilize it. Again, NPC coming with some great information for the industry, and hope you guys have a great weekend. Thank you for getting on.
Happy belated Father's Day, by the way, guys.
Yeah,
you too, guys. And happy upcoming July 4th.